One minute, I was watching a hole get dug for a swimming pool. The next, a stranger I'd never seen before was on my land, filming me like I was the final boss of some home improvement crime. She shouted that I was destroying community values, and called the cops on the spot because, apparently, building a pool in the middle of 15,000 acres of ranch land is now a felony in her book. I didn't know what was funnier, her outrage, or the fact that she clearly had no idea who she was dealing with. Ever had an HOA warrior charge into your life uninvited? Tell me what state you're watching from, because misplaced authority sure loves to travel. The morning had started out so peacefully. I'd been standing next to my half-finished swimming pool, watching the excavator operator carefully shape the deep end, while my horses grazed peacefully in the distance. The dry needle basin stretched out before me, 15,000 acres of untouched Montana paradise that had belonged to the Lindell family for more than a century. My great-grandfather had claimed this land back when Montana was still wild and weed, but been the stewards of this entire valley ever since. The crisp morning air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, and I found myself smiling, thinking about how much my kids would love splashing around in that pool once summer hit. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of an expensive engine struggling up my dirt road. A pristine white BMW appeared, kicking up dust all over its spotless paint job. Out stepped a woman who looked like she'd just walked out of a corporate boardroom and somehow gotten completely lost in rural Montana. Her bob haircut was so perfectly shaped it could have been carved out of marble, and she clutched her phone like it was a weapon. Before I could even say hello, she marched right up to me with the confidence of someone who's never been told no in their life. "Excuse me, you need to stop this construction immediately," she announced, holding up her phone and tapping the screen. I could see she was recording, probably documenting what she considered a crime in progress. "This swimming pool is a complete violation of our community standards." I set down my coffee mug and turned to face her properly, keeping my voice calm and friendly, even though her tone was aggressive. "Good morning to you too, ma'am. I'm Bo Lindell and this is my ranch. I'm not sure what community you're referring to, but this construction is happening on private property that's been in my family for generations." She rolled her eyes dramatically like I was a clueless bumpkin who didn't understand how the civilized world worked. "I am Ramona Cly, president of the Dry Needle Hills Homeowners Association, and we have oversight authority for aesthetic compliance throughout this entire region." She waved her hand around like she was unveiling the valley to an invisible jury. "Your little project here is destroying the natural beauty that our residents pay premium prices to enjoy." That's when I couldn't help but let out a chuckle, not because I was trying to be rude, but because the situation was starting to feel like a bad sitcom. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this ranch existed long before any HOA set up shop out here. My family's owned this land since 1923. Pretty sure we don't fall under your jurisdiction." But Ramona wasn't hearing any of it. She stepped closer to the excavation site, probably trying to get a better angle for her little documentary. "Jurisdiction is exactly what we're talking about here," she insisted. "The HOA has clear authority to maintain standards throughout the valley, and this monstrosity is completely unacceptable." She gestured wildly at the construction site, which, honestly, just looked like a rectangular hole in the dirt to me. Soon it would be a swimming pool filled with water and laughter, but right now, it was just earth. As Ramona got more animated, she began stepping backward to get what I'm sure she thought would be a dramatic wide shot of the destruction. What she didn't realize was that she was moving closer and closer to the excavator, which was still running and had just scooped up a massive bucket of muddy earth. The operator, bless him, was waving at her to move, but she was too caught up in her speech to notice. "This is exactly the kind of selfish behavior that ruins property values for everyone," she declared. Just as the excavator swung around and dumped its load, a spray of mud and dirt flew through the air, catching her perfectly and transforming her from polished corporate executive to abstract art piece in about 2 seconds flat. The look on her face was priceless. She stood there in absolute shock, mud dripping from her immaculate hair, her business attire now more brown than pink. Her phone screen was splattered in whatever audience she thought she had. "Probably just got the performance of a lifetime. You did that on purpose," she sputtered, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. I held up my hands. "Ma'am, nobody forced you to walk behind heavy machinery. That's just basic job site safety." The excavator operator was doing his best not to laugh, and honestly, I was fighting back a grin too. There's just something poetic about someone getting a face full of reality when they try to control what's not theirs. Ramona's expression twisted from shock to pure rage, faster than a Montana thunderstorm. She pointed a muddy finger at me and declared, "This isn't over. I'm calling the authorities, and they're going to shut down this whole operation." She stomped back toward her BMW, leaving muddy boot prints in the dirt and muttering something about violations and permits. As she opened the car door, she turned back one last time and shouted, "There will be police officers here to arrest you." I just smiled and waved. "I'll be right here waiting, ma'am. Have a wonderful day." Her BMW disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust and wounded pride, and I stood there wondering how far she was really willing to take this. She had no idea who she was dealing with, but she was about to find out. 2 hours later, while I was inside grabbing another cup of coffee, I got what might be the most ironic phone call in the history of law enforcement. Apparently, Ramona had gone straight to 911, reporting what she considered to be a serious crime in progress. "I need police officers here immediately," she'd told the dispatcher, her voice full of outrage. "There's a man conducting unauthorized construction, violating building codes, and threatening community safety." The dispatcher, ever the professional, told her an officer would be dispatched to the site. What Ramona didn't know was that the officer assigned to investigate was Deputy Gideon Tate, who had worked under my supervision for the past 4 years. When Gideon saw the address on his screen, I'm sure he nearly dropped his coffee. Unauthorized construction, building violations, threats to community safety. At the ranch owned by the county sheriff, he called me before heading out. I could hear the laughter in his voice as he explained the situation. "Boss, I've got a complaint about you. Some lady says you're running an illegal construction operation." I paused for a second, then grinned. "Don't tell her who I am, Gideon. Just play it by the book. I want to see how far she's willing to push this. Because sometimes, the best way to deal with people like Ramona is to give them just enough rope to hang their own ridiculous narrative." Exactly what they were asking for. About 20 minutes later, I heard the familiar sound of a patrol car coming up the drive. Gideon climbed out wearing his full uniform, trying his best to look serious and official despite the absurdity of the situation. "Afternoon, sir," he said loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "I've received a complaint about construction activities on this property. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I played my part perfectly, adopting the slightly nervous tone of a concerned citizen who definitely didn't want any trouble with the law. "Of course, officer. I certainly don't want any problems. Is there some kind of issue with my pool construction?" Behind his professional demeanor, I could see Gideon struggling not to crack a smile. That's when Ramona made her grand reappearance. She had apparently gone home to clean up and change clothes, because she was now wearing an entirely new outfit. Not only that, but she had also upgraded her recording setup, bringing along what looked like professional-grade camera equipment. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she announced, marching toward us with renewed confidence. "This man has been completely uncooperative and hostile. He's conducting illegal construction activities and threatening the safety and property values of our entire community." Gideon nodded seriously and pulled out his notepad, playing the role of the dutiful law enforcement officer investigating a serious complaint. "Ma'am, I'll need to examine the evidence and speak with both parties before making any determinations. Sir, do you have permits for this construction project?" I nodded and pulled out my folder of paperwork, which was not only completely legitimate but also neatly organized and up to date. "Yes, officer, everything should be in order. I obtained all the necessary permits from the county before beginning work." In her excitement to capture the perfect shot of justice being served, Ramona started backing up again to get a wider angle of the confrontation. You'd think she would have learned her lesson from the mud incident earlier, but apparently not. As she stepped backward while narrating her video, she failed to notice the large pile of horse manure my animals had left behind during their morning graze. "This is exactly why we need strong community standards," she was saying, just as her shoes found their unfortunate target. Down she went right into it. Her video instantly turned from righteous crusade to absolute catastrophe. Gideon had to turn away to compose himself, pretending to cough while actually trying not to burst out laughing. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, offering her a hand with the most professional tone he could manage. After reviewing all my paperwork and confirming that everything was completely legal and properly permitted, Gideon delivered his official verdict. "Sir, all your documentation appears to be in order. A construction is taking place on private property with proper permits, and I don't see any violations of county regulations." Ramona's jaw dropped open in disbelief, as if the very idea of legal construction was foreign to her. "That's impossible. There have to be violations. What about community standards? What about environmental impact?" Gideon shook his head politely. "Ma'am, those would be civil matters between private parties, not criminal violations that require police intervention." But Ramona wasn't ready to back down. With horse manure still clinging to her clothes and her online audience probably growing by the minute, she pulled out what she clearly believed was her ace in the hole. "Fine, if you won't handle this properly, I demand to speak with the sheriff. I want the highest authority in this county to see what's happening here." That's when I couldn't resist a little smile. This woman was so determined to escalate the situation that she was literally demanding to speak to me. "Ma'am, I'd be very interested to meet this sheriff myself. I'm sure he'd have some fascinating insights into this situation." Gideon was biting his lip so hard I thought he might actually draw blood. "I can certainly arrange for you to speak with the sheriff, ma'am," he said, his voice full of controlled amusement. "In fact, I'll make sure he comes out here personally to address your concerns." The next morning brought a whole new level of drama to my peaceful valley. Ramona had apparently spent the entire night plotting her next move, because by sunrise, She was already working on what she called an online community action group. Her video from the previous day featuring her spectacular fall into horse manure had somehow gained over 1,200 views overnight, though I suspect most people were watching for the entertainment value rather than supporting her cause. But you have to admire her persistence. Not many people would double down after becoming an accidental internet meme. But Ramona was apparently made of sterner stuff than your average HOA president. Her first move was to create an online petition titled "Stop Pool Vandalism in Dry Needle Basin," complete with dramatic photos of my construction site, which she had clearly taken with a telephoto lens from the road. The petition claimed my pool was an environmental disaster and a threat to community values that needed to be stopped immediately. She printed out 200 copies and began going door to door throughout the HOA subdivision, armed with a clipboard and an intensity that probably scared more than a few of her neighbors. Her approach wasn't so much friendly neighbors seeking support as it was overly enthusiastic salesperson who doesn't take no for an answer. The response from the community was mixed, to put it diplomatically. Some signed just to make her leave, others shut their doors without saying a word. But there were also plenty of residents who knew my family's history in this valley, and they weren't about to sign anything that went against the Lindells. One encounter, in particular, caught my attention. I happened to be parked in my truck down the road when I watched Ramona approach a small house where 82-year-old Miss Patterson lived. When the door opened, Ramona immediately launched into her prepared speech about community standards and declining property values. But Miss Patterson wasn't having any of it. "Young lady," she said in a voice that carried across the yard, "the Lindell family has been good to this community since before you were born. If Bo wants to build a pool on his own land, that's his business." Here's where things got interesting. Ramona's response wasn't just predictably dramatic, it was telling. "But ma'am, you don't understand the long-term damage this construction could cause to our property values and community aesthetic." Miss Patterson smiled and shook her head. "Honey, that family owns this entire valley. They've been taking care of this land since the 1920s. I think they know what they're doing." That's when I saw something click behind Ramona's eyes. A moment of confusion. The first real flicker of doubt since this whole thing started. For the first time, she looked unsure. "What do you mean?" she asked, blinking. "They own the entire valley." But Miss Patterson had already begun closing her door with the quiet finality of someone who'd said her piece. As soon as she got home, Ramona apparently went straight to her computer and started researching the Lindell family and our deep connection to Dry Needle Basin. I can only imagine what she found: old newspaper clippings about my great-grandfather's original homestead, claim, records of land acquisitions and deeds passed down through the generations, and probably plenty of mentions of our family's long-standing involvement in the community. What she probably didn't find, however, was anything recent about my current position as the county sheriff. I've always preferred to keep a low profile, especially out here. Give me boots, ranch clothes, and a sunrise over paperwork and polished brass any day. But for the first time, I could see doubt creeping into Ramona's otherwise unshakable confidence. Later that week, she took her campaign to the local farmers market. She'd set up a full petition booth complete with a folding table, laminated posters, and a big bold title, "Stop Illegal Construction in Dry Needle Basin." Unfortunately for her, the farmers market crowd wasn't exactly eager to jump on her bandwagon. Most of the shoppers were longtime locals, people who'd known my family for decades. Many of them had grown up attending barbecues on our ranch or swimming in the big pond during the summer. Ramona seemed oblivious to this dynamic until it started playing out right in front of her. Kids began recognizing me and ran over to say hello, calling me Uncle Bo like they always had. I gave them high fives and knelt down to ask about school and their horses. Ramona's tight smile grew increasingly strained as she tried to maintain her activist facade. But it's hard to sell someone as a public threat when the neighborhood children are hugging them and asking when they can come visit the barn again. One little girl approached Ramona with a simple, innocent question that seemed to rattle her more than any legal argument ever could. "Do you know Uncle Bo? He lets us pet his horses sometimes." The woman tried to fake a warm smile, but it was about as convincing as a cardboard cutout in a rainstorm. Then Mother Nature decided to join the conversation. A sudden gust of wind ripped through the market and caught her stack of petition papers, sending them flying across the square like confetti. Ramona scrambled to catch them, arms flailing as papers cartwheeled through the air. Her pop-up tent buckled under the wind and collapsed behind her, a metal frame crumpling like a defeated parade float. Several kids gleefully joined the chase, treating it like a game, while Ramona ducked and darted to grab each sheet before they vanished by the time she gathered everything up. Her once professional setup had transformed into a muddy, wrinkled disaster. Standing there with dirt on her knees, wind-blown hair, and a tangled tent at her feet, she looked less like a champion of justice and more like someone who'd lost a bet with a weather report. I watched from a distance, sipping my coffee, and couldn't help but wonder if she was finally starting to question whether she'd chosen the right battle. But if Ramona was having second thoughts, she didn't show it the next few days. Instead, she underwent a dramatic transformation into what she apparently believed was a full-fledged legal expert. Armed with nothing but free internet resources and the dangerous confidence that comes from misreading them, she printed over 40 pages of building codes, zoning laws, and construction ordinances. Most of it didn't apply to me in the slightest. Her research focused on regulations for commercial developments, urban subdivisions, or city properties, all of which had absolutely nothing to do with my private ranch situated on unincorporated county land. But technicalities like relevance and jurisdiction weren't going to stop Ramona. In her mind, she'd found the smoking gun, the proof that would bring my pool construction to a screeching halt. She spent hours assembling what she clearly believed was a professional-grade cease and desist letter. It was loaded with legal jargon, lifted word for word from government websites, law blogs, and sample templates. The tone of the document made it sound like she had the full weight of the Department of Justice behind her. Even though it was essentially a patchwork of misunderstood laws and misplaced passion, I had to give her credit. It was an impressive amount of effort to put into something that was fundamentally incorrect. When she returned to my ranch for another round, she came fully armed. Her car was stuffed with file folders, printed binders, color-coded tabs, and even a tablet computer that she presumably brought to record what she thought would be my public capitulation. I was out near the pasture, watching the horses graze, the early morning sun painting golden highlights across the hills, when I heard her BMW grinding its way up the dirt road again. This time something was different. The usual righteous fire in her stride had dimmed slightly. Her posture was still confident, but there was a tension in her jaw, a tightness around the eyes. It was desperation, not defeat, but definitely the awareness that her tactics weren't producing the results she'd expected. "I've done my research," she declared, before she even reached me. She was waving a thick folder in the air, like it was a courtroom exhibit. "You're in violation of building codes, and I have the documentation to prove it." I set down the bucket of water I'd been carrying and turned toward her, genuinely curious now. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I actually felt a twinge of sympathy. Here was someone who had clearly poured hours into something she truly believed was airtight, and she didn't yet realize it was built on sand. "That sounds serious," I said calmly. "Where exactly did you find all this information?" Ramona lit up like she'd been waiting for that question. She opened her folder and began leafing through the stack of papers, proud of every printout, every annotation. Then she launched into a passionate explanation of her findings, reading aloud passages from various codes and ordinances. She cited section numbers, quoted definitions, and named departments like she was giving testimony before Congress. According to her, the International Building Code required all pool projects to undergo setback analysis, receive board approval, and follow specific drainage guidelines. She mentioned things about runoff impact, community noise restrictions, and commercial fence height standards. I listened patiently, not interrupting once, nodding occasionally just to let her finish. When she was done, she held the binder out, for me like it was the Holy Grail. I flipped through it. "It took less than 2 minutes to spot the problem, ma'am," I said gently. "I really appreciate the effort you've put into this, but these codes apply to commercial properties and developments within city limits. This is a rural ranch on unincorporated county land. These regulations don't apply here." She blinked at me, silent for several seconds. It was like she was processing an entirely foreign concept, one she'd never even considered. "Laws are laws," she said finally, though her voice lacked the certainty it once held. "You can't just ignore building codes because you live in the country." That's when I decided to ask the question that had been circling in my mind since the beginning. "Ramona, I'm curious. What exactly gives your HOA the authority to regulate construction outside of the subdivision boundaries?" She froze, her eyes darted left and right, searching for a response that simply didn't exist. "The HOA has clear oversight authority for maintaining community standards throughout the entire region," she said, but her voice wavered. It was the first time I'd seen her uncertain. Right then, as we stood beside the fence post, my horse Thunderbolt wandered over to investigate the situation. Horses are naturally curious animals, and Thunderbolt was particularly fond of sticking his nose into people's businesses, especially if it involved anything he could chew. But before either of us could stop him, Thunderbolt reached out and grabbed the corner of Ramona's carefully compiled folder with his teeth. "No, stop that!" Ramona shrieked, tugging at the folder as Thunderbolt decided this stack of codes made for an interesting snack. Papers flew into the air, some torn, others dragged across the dirt. A few bore the unmistakable marks of horse teeth, as if Thunderbolt himself had delivered a final judgment on her legal crusade. Standing there, with mud on her shoes, dirt on her knees, and half her documents shredded or slobbered on, Ramona looked around the pasture in disbelief, like the universe itself was conspiring against her. And in a way, maybe it was. She pulled out what she clearly thought was her trump card. "Fine, if you won't listen to reason, I'm calling the sheriff's office directly. I'll have them send someone out here who understands the law." I couldn't help but smile at that threat. The woman was so determined to escalate the situation that she was literally threatening me with myself. "That sounds like an excellent idea, Ramona," I replied, I've been wanting to have a conversation with the sheriff about this situation myself. Her confidence came roaring back like someone who just remembered they had an ace up their sleeve. Good, because once the sheriff sees what you're doing here, this whole operation is going to be shut down permanently. The next morning started, like any other me on the porch with a hot cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the Montana mountains in soft golds and rosy pinks peaceful. Meanwhile, Ramona was apparently working herself into a full-blown state of righteous indignation as she dialed the sheriff's office, her voice rising with moral outrage. "This is an emergency situation," she told our dispatcher. "I need the sheriff to respond immediately to a serious violation of building codes and community safety regulations. Now, our dispatcher is no stranger to over-the-top calls. She's handled everything from cows and swimming pools to sword-wielding teens on her TVs, so she calmly assured Ramona that the sheriff would personally respond to her complaint within the next 30 minutes. What Ramona didn't realize was that she had just set into motion one of the most ironically perfect law enforcement responses in the history of Dry Needle County. Because that call, it came directly to me. I couldn't help but laugh when I saw her name on the dispatch notes. Here was a woman who had spent the better part of a week threatening to call the sheriff, insisting the sheriff would take her side, and now she was finally getting exactly what she'd asked for. The only problem was she had no idea that the sheriff she was demanding to see was the same man she'd been accusing. I decided it was time to end the charade, once and for all. I walked into my closet and, for the first time since this mess began, pulled out my full sheriff's uniform. Sometimes, the most efficient way to deal with stubborn people is to give them exactly what they think they want. The drive to my own ranch felt surreal. Here I was, county sheriff, responding in an official patrol vehicle, in full uniform, to investigate myself. Gideon had offered to tag along for moral support, but I told him no, I needed to handle this personally. That as I approached the property, it became clear Ramona had been preparing for this moment like it was opening night. On Broadway, she had multiple cameras set up around the construction site, likely hoping to capture her moment of victory for her ever-growing online audience. There were folding chairs, water bottles, and several neighborhood residents gathered like they were waiting for a public execution. Among the dozen or so people, I recognized a few HOA members probably lured here with promises of justice being served. Ramona herself was standing front and center, wearing what looked like her sharpest power outfit and holding a brand new folder of documents, undoubtedly replacements for the ones Thunderbolt had turned into pasture confetti. She lit up with excitement when she saw the sheriff's vehicle approach. You could practically see the gears turning in her head as she envisioned her big moment. She probably thought she'd finally cornered me the moment I stepped out in full uniform. Was priceless. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible from across the property, but nothing compared to the look on Ramona's face. Her expression moved through a full emotional cycle in about 3 seconds: confidence, confusion, shock, and then something that looked very much like horror. Her camera, aimed and ready to record the dramatic arrival of justice, instead captured her jaw dropping open. The folder slipped from her fingers. Her whole body seemed to go rigid with disbelief. You could almost hear the sound of her worldview crumbling. "Good afternoon, folks," I said in my most official sheriff's voice, touching the brim of my hat. "I'm Sheriff Lindell. I understand someone here needed to speak to me about a law enforcement matter." Silence, dead silence. You could have heard a gnat sneeze. Ramona stared at me like she'd just seen a ghost riding a unicorn. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked at the people around her, then back at me, then back at her camera, as if hoping one of them would explain what was happening. The crowd was catching on. A few of the neighbors looked at each other, brows raised, trying to silently confirm that yes, the man Ramona had been dragging through the mud all week was indeed the sheriff she had summoned. Finally, she found her voice. But you can't be." I nodded, polite and steady. "I'm Sheriff Bo Lindell, ma'am. I've held this position for the past 8 years. Before that, I was deputy for 6 years under Sheriff Langston." Her eyes flicked to the badge on my chest, the patch on my sleeve, then the vehicle behind me. It was clear that this realization was like trying to swallow a bowling ball. This is a conflict of interest," she cried. "You can't investigate yourself. That's not how this works. You're supposed to be impartial." I pulled out my official notepad like I'd done 100 times before. "Ma'am," I said professionally, "let's begin with the basics. What exactly would you like to report? What crime do you believe has been committed on this property?" For a moment, she just blinked at me. It was like her brain had hit a wall and was now rebooting. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. It's not every day you get to watch someone realize they've been yelling at the very person they'd been demanding to see. Someone in the crowd, a gray-haired man in a plaid jacket, let out a short chuckle that quickly turned into a full laugh. Another neighbor joined in. Soon half the crowd was quietly snickering. Ramona's dream of a dramatic, victorious takedown had just turned into one of the most painfully public cell phones in recent memory. On her cameras were rolling the entire time. This isn't how this was supposed to go," she stammered, looking from one amused face to another. as if anyone might jump in and restore her version of reality. "Ma'am," I said again, this time with just a touch more kindness in my tone, "I'm here to investigate your complaint about building code violations and community safety issues. Could you please explain to me what specific crimes you believe have been committed on this property?" The question floated in the air like a final puzzle piece falling into place. Everyone knew the answer. Everyone knew there were no crimes, no building code violations, and no authority for her to be making any of these demands. Ramona looked down at her scattered folder on the ground, then back up at me, then over at the crowd. They weren't angry, they weren't hostile, they were just amused and done playing along with her game. For the first time since I'd met her, Ramona Clyde didn't have a speech ready. She didn't have a quote or a rulebook to hide behind. She didn't have a plan. She had nothing, and sometimes the best comebacks don't need words at all. They just need silence on the truth. The quiet stretched on long enough for birds to start chirping again, and for one of the horses to wander over, chewing lazily. Even the cameras kept rolling, but no one had anything left to say. Eventually, Ramona found her voice again, though it came out shaky and desperate. This is a clear conflict of interest. You can't investigate yourself. There have to be laws against this." I nodded thoughtfully, as if I was seriously considering her point. "Ma'am, you're absolutely right that I can't investigate myself, but first, you need to tell me what exactly I'm supposed to have done wrong. What specific law have I broken?" That simple question seemed to stump her completely. She just stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It's amazing how quickly someone's entire argument crumbles when you ask them for specifics. "Building violations," she blurted out. "Unauthorized construction, environmental damage, community standards, violations." I pulled out my folder of permits and documentation, the same exact paperwork that Gideon had already reviewed and approved earlier that week. "Could you point out which specific building code I've violated? Because these are all the county permits and approvals required for constructing a swimming pool on private property in unincorporated county land." As I laid the documents across the hood of my patrol vehicle, several of the neighbors stepped closer to get a better look. Their curiosity was starting to overtake their amusement. That's when I decided this was a good opportunity to educate everyone, watching Ramona included, about how local jurisdictions and property rights actually work. "Since we're all here," I began, "let me clear up some confusion. This ranch is private property, and it's been in my family since 1923. It's not part of any city or municipality. It's also located entirely outside of the boundaries of the Dry Needle Hills HOA. I unfolded a county survey map and laid it beside the permits for everyone to see. "The HOA's subdivision boundaries end about half a mile that way," I said, pointing down the road. "That means they have no say over what happens on this land, no enforcement power, no jurisdiction, no authority." You could see the realization dawn on some of the faces in the crowd. A woman standing near the front, someone I recognized from the edge of the subdivision, spoke up. "Wait, so the HOA can't actually regulate anything out here at all?" I shook my head. "That's right. Homeowners associations only have control over properties that are specifically within their official boundaries, and where the owners have contractually agreed to abide by HOA rules when they bought in." To some people, this was clearly a shocking revelation. It was as if they were hearing, for the first time, that HOA rules don't apply to everyone and everything in sight. Meanwhile, Ramona was flipping through her folder like a student who just realized they'd studied the wrong chapters for the final exam. But what about community standards?" she demanded. "What about property values? What about the environmental impact?" I gestured to the rolling hills surrounding us. "Ma'am, my family has been taking care of this land for over 100 years. We've managed it responsibly, protected the water table, maintained wildlife habitats, and helped our neighbors when they needed it. I think our record speaks for itself." That's when someone else in the crowd decided to chime in and add, "It changed everything. Ramona, didn't you know that some of the houses in the subdivision are actually built on land leased from the Lindell family?" A low murmur spread through the group. People began glancing at each other. Some looked confused, others looked genuinely alarmed. Ramona went pale. That's not true. We own our houses." I nodded. "You do, but not all of the land. When the subdivision was built about 15 years ago, my father leased several parcels to the developer. Some lots were sold outright, but roughly 1/3 of the homes are built on land where the mineral rights and usage agreements still belong to the Lindell family." It was like I'd dropped a live grenade. People started whispering and pulling out their phones. They were trying to figure out whether they were living on leased ground, possibly even on land I still technically owned. One man, clearly piecing it all together, looked straight at me. "So you're saying she's been trying to boss around the landowner?" I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The silence was enough. Ramona, to her credit, tried to rally. "There have to be regulations," she said. "There has to be oversight. You can't just do whatever you want." But her voice was getting quieter now, smaller, like even she didn't quite believe what she was saying anymore. And the crowd, they weren't with her. They weren't defending her. People were starting to shake their heads. A few neighbors walked away, clearly embarrassed they'd believed her. And through it all, Her camera kept recording. The video she had set up to document her triumphant takedown of a rogue neighbor was instead capturing her total collapse in real time, in front of the entire community. It was like watching a reverse hero arc, a fall from grace in high definition. In one last desperate attempt to regain some control, Ramona whipped out her phone and yelled, "I'm calling the state police. I'm reporting corruption and abuse of power." That got laughs. Real laughs. One guy actually snorted. Another woman muttered, "Oh, give it up, Ramona." I kept my composure. "You're welcome to contact any agency you like, ma'am," I said evenly. "But just to clarify, no crime has been committed, no laws have been broken. I'm simply building a swimming pool on my own land, with the county's full approval. Sometimes, the truth doesn't need drama, just the facts." The final blow didn't come from MIT, came from within. One of the HOA board members who'd shown up to support Ramona stepped forward. He looked uncomfortable, like someone trying to back out of a bad investment. "Ramona," he said, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about your leadership, and whether you've been honest with the rest of us." Heads nodded around him. Several people murmured in agreement. Ramona's face tightened. You could see her holding back tears or rage, maybe both. But she knew it was over. Stood in front of a crowd that no longer respected her, in front of a camera that had just live-streamed her downfall, and in front of the very man she'd tried so hard to discredit, who just happened to be the county sheriff. Ramona Cly hadn't just lost a petty argument over a pool. She'd lost her credibility, her position, and whatever standing she'd built in the community she once tried to control. The aftermath came fast. Within 48 hours, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. Every seat was filled. The topic, a vote of no confidence in the current president. The motion passed unanimously. The reasons were clear: abuse of power, misrepresentation of HOA authority, and pursuit of a personal vendetta under the guise of community interest, or her leadership was revoked, her title stripped, and her influence evaporated like mist in the morning sun. No one even bothered to contest the decision. The vote wasn't even close. The vote was 7-0, with Ramona herself being the only board member not present, having apparently locked herself in her house to avoid the embarrassment of facing her former constituents. A friendly woman named Mrs. Kim was elected as interim president, given a clear mandate to rebuild trust with the wider community and to establish guidelines for HOA activities that actually made sense. Her leadership style was calm, collaborative, and most importantly, rooted in reality. In one final act of desperation, Ramona did follow through with her threat and called the state police, insisting that the sheriff's department was guilty of corruption and abuse of power. The trooper who returned her call was polite but firm. He calmly explained that sheriffs are elected officials with jurisdiction over their counties, and that building a swimming pool with proper permits on private property does not, by any legal definition, qualify as abuse of power. When she tried to escalate further up the chain of command, she was told still politely that the matter was closed, and that if she had any remaining grievances, her best course of action would be civil litigation. There's an old saying about holes and shovels: sometimes the best thing to do is just stop digging. The community response in the days that followed was exactly what you'd expect from a tight-knit, rural town that had just watched one of its own make a complete spectacle of herself. Yes, there was a little embarrassment, some muttering behind closed doors, and a fair amount of whispered gossip, but there was also a collective sigh of relief. The storm had passed, and no one had drowned. Over the next several days, more than a few residents approached me quietly at the post office, at the diner, even while pumping gas. They wanted to apologize for having signed Ramona's petition. Many admitted they didn't really understand what they were signing, only that they'd felt pressured, misinformed, or flat-out manipulated. I told each one of them the same thing. No hard feelings. Small communities are like families. Misunderstandings happen. What mattered most was that we'd found a peaceful resolution. Besides, I told them with a smile, the whole thing had been more entertaining than cable TV. But the real surprise came when Mrs. Kim called me late one afternoon. "Sheriff Lind," she said warmly, "the HOA board was wondering if you'd be willing to host a community barbecue once your pool is finished. We think it'd be a great way to bring everyone back together and show that there are no lingering hard feelings." I told her I thought it was a fantastic idea, and just like that, we started planning the biggest community event Dry Needle Basin had seen in years. News of the barbecue spread faster than the petition ever had. People were eager not just to see the infamous pool that had sparked all the drama, but to gather in a more positive, neighborly way. Local businesses stepped up to donate food and supplies. Volunteers offered to handle grilling, setup, and music. Even people who hadn't said much during the conflict were excited to be part of something healing. It was shaping up to be the kind of event that reminds folks what community really means. The pool was finished 2 weeks later, and I have to admit, it turned out even better than I'd hoped. The water shimmered under the Montana sun. The landscaping was clean and natural, with views of the valley stretching out in every direction. My wife was already envisioning family parties, summer nights with friends, and peaceful morning swims. My kids were thrilled beyond words. But before any of that, it was time for our barbecue. The day couldn't have been more perfect. The sky was bright blue, the temperature mild, with just enough breeze to carry the scent of smoked brisket and grilled corn across the yard. People started arriving around noon, carrying side dishes and folding chairs, homemade desserts and pitchers of lemonade. Within an hour, the backyard was buzzing with conversation and laughter. Folks who'd never spoken before were now swapping stories like old friends. Kids darted through the grass with water balloons, while adults sipped sweet tea and caught up on life. Even some of the more skeptical residents from the subdivision came, curious to see what all the fuss had been about. Gideon showed up in his civilian clothes, blending in easily with the crowd. After a while, I stood up and called for everyone's attention. Folks, I said, before we break into the pies and cobblers, I'd like to recognize someone special. Deputy Gideon Tate has been serving Dry Needle County for the past 4 years with integrity, heart, and grit. I'm proud to announce his promotion to senior deputy. The crowd erupted in applause. Gideon, ever modest, turned red but smiled. Why, it felt good to celebrate something positive, especially after so many weeks of drama and division. Inevitably, someone brought up the question that was on everyone's mind. Whatever happened to Ramona? A man asked from the grill station. Mrs. Kim stepped in with the grace that had made her a perfect choice for HOA president. She's decided to relocate, she said simply. She's looking for a community that might better match her lifestyle. Her house went up for sale last week. No one said anything cruel, but the general consensus was clear. It was probably for the best. The highlight of the day came just before sunset. Someone counted down from 3, and then a dozen children cannonballed into the pool all at once, sending a tidal wave of water across the deck and soaking several adults who hadn't moved fast enough. Laughter broke out everywhere. The pool filled with splashing kids, floating tubes, and the sound of pure joy. It was exactly what I'd pictured when I decided to build it. Not just a swimming pool, but a space for connection, peace, and happiness. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the guests began to pack up, I stood quietly by the edge of the water, taking it all in. The laughter, the warmth, the smell of barbecue lingering in the air. What had begun as a simple backyard project had morphed into a full-blown conflict. Then, somehow, it had become something even better, a reminder that when people listen, forgive, and come together, even the most ridiculous situations can lead to something beautiful. 3 months later, I was sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the first light of dawn stretch across the mountains, when Gideon's patrol car pulled into the drive. "Morning, boss," he said as he walked up. "Got a new complaint for you." I raised an eyebrow, half laughing. "Please tell me it's not another HOA emergency." Gideon grinned. "Nope, this one's different. Mrs. Patterson says you're swimming too quietly in the mornings. Her grandkids like to listen to the splashing sounds while they eat breakfast, and you're not making enough noise to entertain them." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. "Well, we can't disappoint the kids, can we?" With that, I walked straight to the edge of the pool, took a running leap, and cannonballed in with the biggest splash I could muster. Sometimes being sheriff means serving your community in ways you never expected. But of all the complaints I've ever received, that one might just be my favorite. We're HF exposed. And that's just one of many unbelievable tales from America's wildest neighborhoods. Catch the next video, we promise it's even crazier.